Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this edition of our policy series of talks. My name is Warren Mabey. I'm the director of the School of Policy Studies here at Queen's University, and I'm delighted that you are able to join us for this lecture. Before we get into the main event, I do want to take a moment to acknowledge that Queen's University, where I'm sitting right now, is based or located on the traditional territories of the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe peoples. And it is a privilege for us to be able to live here and to work here and to learn from each other here. The virtual nature of this lecture means that we have people on all kinds of different traditional territories, potentially all across the world. Do take a moment to think about those who have come before and those whose lands on which we now enjoy the privileges of being able to work and to learn from each other. It's an important step in our journey towards reconciliation. I'm also very excited about today's lecture, and I'm going to introduce Professor Chris Cotton. Professor Cotton is in the Department of Economics and has been working with the School of Policy Studies for the last few years, has become an important member of our teaching faculty and of our school. And he will host today's W. Edmund Clark Distinguished Lecture Series on Public Policy. So at this point, I'd like to hand over to Professor Cotton.
Thank you, Warren. So today's lecture, the W. Edmund Clark Distinguished Lecture, is made possible through a generous gift, a generous donation from the family of Edmund Clark. Dr. Clark was the former president and CEO of TD Bank Financial Group. He earned his undergraduate degree from the University of Toronto and completed his graduate studies, including his PhD, from Harvard University. Dr. Clark and his wife, Frances, had 4 children, 3 of whom are Queen's graduates. This lecture is one of many collaborations, ongoing collaborations between the School of Policy Studies and the Department of Economics, which co-host this event. Since the first lecture in 2011, we've had many high-profile academics and thought leaders visit Queen's for this lecture. This year, we're delighted to welcome Kaushik Basu to deliver what's going to be just an outstanding and timely lecture on authoritarian regimes. Dr. Basu is professor of economics and the C. Marks Professor of International Studies at Cornell University, where I got to know him when he served as a member of my dissertation committee. But he's done a lot more than just that. So he's from 2019 to 2012, he was the chief economist. He was the chief economic advisor to the government of India. And then following that, from 2012 to 2016, he served as chief economist for the World Bank. And he has served more recently as the president of the International Economic Association. He's currently, in addition to his many other positions, a resident fellow at the Brookings Institute in Washington, D.C., and Dr. Basu is widely published in the areas of development economics, industrial organization, game theory, welfare economics, and law and economics. I started counting his publications, and I got to 100 and realized I was still 2 decades away from the current period. And so he has over 200 academic research publications, 21 books in which he was the author, translated into several languages, and 21 additional books, I believe, in which he was the editor. Not only is Dr. Basu a prolific economist, but he also serves as an incredible example for how one can bring both a rigorous academic research approach together with a real interest in policy and making helping advise policymakers around the world. So without further delay, I want to welcome Kaushik Basu to give the Clark lecture. Well, okay, one more delay. It's just housekeeping issues in terms of When you're asking questions, we'll have plenty of time for questions in the later part of the event. When you want to ask a question and get in the queue, add it to the Q&A feature on Zoom, and we'll be monitoring that and asking after his initial presentation. So now, without further delay, Professor Basu.
Thank you very much, Professor Warren Maybe, Professor Chris Cotton. The professor sounds odd to me because my memory was of Chris as a student. Thank you very much for the great honor for letting me give the W. Edmund Clark Distinguished Lecture. And I've seen the list of my predecessors, a remarkable group of people. The topic that I've chosen is contemporary in a way that we wish it were not, which is the rise of authoritarianism, authoritarian leaders. And you can see this. Putin's Russia is the most immediate example. There's Lukashenko's Belarus. There are examples from around the world. It is disconcerting how this has happened, the cropping up of these tyrannical rules. I want to back up a little bit. I want to get into this and then see what is new today. Why is this happening? It is an analytical talk, and I'm actually going to make use of ideas which were very central to my concerns as an economist, as a political economist. In fact, at the time when Chris was a student at Cornell. Since then, I've worked on other things, but I'm coming back to this because of this rise of the importance of this issue. Let me first give you a backdrop, a methodological backdrop, and the challenge for economics. You know, in economics, normal economics, or the way we describe normal science, proceeds by taking on the explicit assumptions of a discipline. You check those assumptions, you put them to test, you collect data. If the assumption is wrong, you change the assumption and build up yet another structure analyzing the economy. That's normal economics or normal science. However, every discipline makes use of assumptions which are so implicit, so hardwired in the minds of the analysts that very often they themselves are not aware of these assumptions. These are, I call them assumptions in the woodwork of the discipline. They are built in a way that we, the practitioners, forget about it. For instance, we've already seen the arrival of behavioral economics, reminding economists that the rationality that we assume in human beings may not always be there. It is, in fact, a bit embarrassing that we needed laboratory experiments to remind economists that rationality is not always there. Other disciplines would not need lab experiments. They can see it all around, but it gets hardwired in the discipline. Some of the most major works in economics arises out of this hardwiring, questioning the hardwiring. And to me, the biggest example, and that saved the world, because the crisis for the world was during the Industrial Revolution, say roughly from 1750 to 1850 or 1860, 100 years, that transformed the world because of the arrival of new technology, also caused distressing problems for the world. And if it wasn't for the fact that there was a huge burst of creative work in economics, helping us understand the new world that we were going to inhabit, that we may have messed up the Industrial Revolution and gone the way of the dinosaur. We came out of that because of new ways of looking at the world, new theories, and new regulations. And it's probably not a coincidence, or if it's a coincidence, it's a lucky coincidence, that the Industrial Revolution coincided with some of the greatest works of economics. So if the Industrial Revolution is roughly 1750 to 1850, 1860, think of the burst of activity of economics. 1776, Adam Smith. 1838, Augustin Cournot. We have David Ricardo, we have Karl Marx. 1848, we have John Stuart Mill's Principles of Economics coming out. So it's an amazing year of change in the structure of the economy and change in the understanding of the economy. And I believe we are entering a very, very similar phase with the digital revolution, with the COVID and the learning by doing of the use of this technology. The global landscape is changing, creating tensions all over from our understanding of the economy, inequality levels going sky high too, and that is my interest today, to political economy. There is somehow a very disturbed, distracted state for the nature of politics in the world. Politics is polarized. There are different groups, warring groups, and we are literally seeing from conflict to war erupting in different places of the world. I want to throw in little bits of ideas. I can do no more than that. I do believe this is a time for major innovative work, and I would urge my professional colleagues, economists, political scientists, game theorists, to collectively put their minds to the challenge that we are facing. And I will merely throw a couple of ingredients towards solving it. But seeing Chris, it reminds me of my earlier interest, and allow me a 5-minute early interest in this subject before I get into what I want to talk about today. You know, one of my most exciting, intellectually exciting moments was in 1984. I was visiting my PhD advisor, Amartya Sen. I was visiting him at Oxford, and Sen told me that at dinner, I was visiting him for one evening. There was a high table dinner, and he said that, what's your interest? What are you interested in right now? And I said, my big interest right now is political economy and power. And he said, in that case, you should sit next to a person who works on this. And I was seated next to Stephen Lukes, an authority on this. What we chatted over that evening, and then he gave me, was a smuggled out copy of a document of Václav Havel, which had been smuggled out of Czechoslovakia, explaining the nature of totalitarianism in Czechoslovakia. That was very exciting because it was one of those dog-eared typed copies that had been translated into English, and Stephen Lukes was working on its publication. That talked about power and politics, which we economists usually like to look away from. And it is time again today to return to this topic because of what we are seeing around the world. Let me get into this. I don't want to spend too much time on the backdrop. Is one important understanding where you need a little bit of game theory. And this is the only place where I'll inflict a tiny bit of formalism on you, is the understanding of group morality. What had been interesting me after I came back to academics from my policy world is very often you see groups behaving badly. A country behaves badly. The group of leaders in a country behave viciously. There are occasions when we want to put the blame at the doorstep of an individual. In what's happening in Ukraine, I do consider Vladimir Putin as directly responsible. But there are also situations where there are groups and collectivities who are caught in a trap where no one may want to do the harm. They may want to do some harm, but not the huge harm that comes about, which is the consequence of the group interactions. In brief, groups can behave in immoral ways where that was not the intention of any individual to behave in that manner. This is something that I stumbled upon. Chris, if I can have one page of the PowerPoint. The first, which is the descriptive page. Perfect. This is where I want to pause. 3 years ago, I actually got working on this problem, and I stumbled upon a tiny little game on how a collective of individuals can behave immorally when the individuals are immoral or someone, in fact, becomes moral. How the becoming of moral can cause immorality is what I got interested in with a game that I described as Greta's Dilemma. It is Greta's Dilemma because this is a game which shows the following. A group of people living a life unmindful of what their actions do to bystanders. In this case, the bystander could be the future generation. We consume, we use the resources recklessly, unmindful of what we are doing to the future bystander. Now, Greta Thunberg comes along, tells us that, look, you have to be sensitive to what your action does to the bystander. Become moral to that minimal extent. Suppose you do become moral. What happens? I want to just illustrate that there are situations in life which are interactive, complex situations where one person becoming moral may make the group behave even more immorally. This is what I called Greta's Dilemma, a game where taking the advice of Greta Thunberg and turning moral can make the group behave worse. That simply poses another challenge, that in game theoretic situations where individuals are interacting strategically, how can we create a better world? This is described with a game. Let's go to the next page. This is the paper where it's published. Yes, this is the page. Yeah, let's go to the next one. The paper is just published in the philosophy journal Synthèse, but I'm going to describe the game to you. Very simply, it's 2 pages of PowerPoint, and then I want to move on to actual dictators and how they may make matters worse in collective interactive situations. It's a 2-player game. It's a look at the left-hand payoff matrix. That is the game. I'll talk about the right-hand side. It's of no consequence to the 2 players. There are 2 players. One player chooses between A and B, and the other player chooses between C and D. And thank you very much. And the payoffs they get, you can see very easily. If player 1 chooses A and 2 chooses C, player A gets $10, and player 1 gets $10, and player 2 gets $11. If player 1 chooses B and 2 chooses D, they both get $11. These are the payoffs over here. And the economy, they have to make a choice. Player 1 has to choose between A and B. Player 2 has to choose between C and D. And it is very easy to see that there is only one place where this economy can settle if the players are selfish. Player 1 is trying to maximize player 1's payoff. Player 2 is trying to maximize player 2's payoff. They will settle at B, D. Player 1 will choose B, correct. And player 2 will choose D. They will get $11 each. You can check for yourself. If anyone deviates unilaterally, that person will do worse. You'll get 10 instead of 11. So BD 11-11 is where they settle down. They are playing this game completely selfishly, and they are quite well off. 10 and 11 are high payoffs. Now, let us say that Greta Thunberg comes along and tells these people that, look, you're playing this game completely selfishly, unmindful of what it does to future generations, but your actions have an effect on how the future generation fares, and the future generation can do nothing to influence you. What happens to the welfare of the future generation as you play this game? That is summed up in the matrix on the right-hand side. So what the right-hand side matrix shows is, if the contemporary players, player 1 and player 2, choose B and D, the future generation will get $4 worth of satisfaction. If the present generation chooses A and C, the future generation will get $2. A and C will lead them, the future generation, to get $2. A and D, the future generation gets $8. B and C, the future generation gets $0. So those are the payoffs of the future generation. And now we can see exactly what happens in this game. If the current generation plays the game, which I've described as before Greta, we just showed, they will end up at 11-11 or BD, which means the future generation will get $4 worth of benefit. And $4 is miserably poor. You're very, very badly off. And we could rightly appeal to the present generation. Look, you can change the effect you have on the future generation. They can be much better off. They can get 8, whereas you will lose only $1 of satisfaction. They'll get $4 of satisfaction just by your changing your behavior. Suppose after that lecture by Greta, player one becomes a moral creature. So both players were selfish. Now player one becomes moral. Let me describe moral. Moral in this case means both of them, moral in this case means that the player is concerned about the future generation. And for simplicity, I will assume that the player treats a future generation's $1 as the same as this person's $1. So if I'm player one, just go back to BD where I was choosing BD, we were at BD. I will now take into account the future generation's payoff. So I will feel, look, BD gives me a satisfaction of $15, 11 for me, 4 for the future generation. I have internalized it. So after I become moral, this before Greta game is going to change, where all my payoffs will now have the additional payoff of what the future generation is getting. So earlier at AC, I was getting 10. Now I'm getting 12. Why? Because I'm counting the $2 the future generation is getting as my payoff. At BD, I was earlier getting 11. Now I'm counting the future generation's 4 and I'm getting 15. So after I become moral, the way Greta Thunberg would want me to be, the game becomes a game which I'm calling Greta's Dilemma, which is on the left-hand side. It's the same game as before, excepting player one has now become conscious about the future generation and their welfare. And this is the new game. But strategic environments where my decision depends on your decision depends on my decision. What Putin does affects Sergei Lavrov. What Sergei Lavrov does attends Putin. You can get very, very complex plays. Come back to this game. The game has now changed with this new game. Look at just the left-hand panel, Greta's Dilemma game, and see what the outcome will be. There is only one stable outcome, where if you get there, you will stay there. This is called the Nash equilibrium for the economists in the audience. AC is the only outcome which will sustain. At AC, if player one deviates, player one, instead of getting 12, will get 11, not worth deviating. If player two deviates from C to D, instead of getting 11, will go to 10, not worth deviating. So the game will settle at AC, which means the future generation, which was earlier getting 4 units, after player one becomes moral and concerned about the future generation, this player is the future generation is going to do worse. Group morality is a complex subject. There is a lot of writing on that. There are papers in philosophy, papers in economics. I do discuss this at some length in my own paper in Synthesis, and this is a complex matter of some interest to us. We can switch this off because I'm now getting into contemporary politics, which I'm going to describe to you in words. I've got PowerPoint later on if you're interested. I'm sure Chris can share my PowerPoint with you, and I can also share my fuller length paper, and I'm going to actually present a little bit of a new paper which I'm currently writing. Let me now explain something in group dynamics which fascinates me: group behavior. Myanmar. We saw recently Myanmar erupting, and there was a time when it appeared that the society is going to erupt altogether and there will be no going back. But the generals for now seem to have got the better of them. There was, in 1989, June 4th, the Tiananmen Square massacre in China. It looked as if China would erupt, but it quietened down. But there are other examples of societies where people wanted to erupt and they did erupt successfully. The revolution took place. A very good example of this is the Jasmine Revolution of Tunisia in 2010. The Tunisian Jasmine Revolution, which started off the entire Middle Eastern eruption, happened in a fascinating way. People were fed up of the tyrannical rule and crony capitalism of Ben Ali, the leader of Tunisia. But for a there to be a proper revolt against a tyrannical leader, you very often need a flare-up point. And in the case of the Jasmine Revolution, there was indeed a flare-up point. On 17th of December 2010, Mohammed Bouazizi, a vendor, burnt himself in the street corner in protest against the government. That coalesced a lot of protests. The protests started building up. For some time, Ben Ali was saying that I'm going to crush the protest and put an end to it. But on the 14th of January 2011, Ben Ali flees the country to Saudi Arabia, and the Jasmine Revolution of Tunisia takes place properly. The leadership is overthrown. We saw fairly recently Belarus, with Lukashenko. Belarus seemed ready to erupt, but it did not happen. Why did it not happen? I want to understand, and I want to give you an explanation. I think I've got an understanding of the kind of situation where eruptions actually on the verge of taking place may not take place. And it is the following. I'm going to give it to you in words very simply. Actually, even writing down would be just writing down 2-3 sentences. And if you wanted one equation, but it can be clarified without the equation. Let me explain. Take the population of Belarus, roughly 10 million people. Assume that all 10 million people want to rise in revolt against Lukashenko's authoritarian regime. Let us also assume that Lukashenko's capacity to incarcerate and jail people is limited. Just to keep the numbers simple, let's assume he can incarcerate 10 of the protesters. You can make it 100, you can make it 1,000, 10,000. Up to a certain number, my logic will go through. So just assume that for now, Lukashenko has space in his prison for 10 people. But all the 10 million people of Belarus want to rise in revolt. It seems hopeless for Lukashenko to stop this. And Lukashenko is virtually giving up when he makes an announcement, a strange announcement. I'm going to create a very artificial example, but I feel in life when overthrowing of rulers takes place successfully and if they do not take place successfully, it is the same kind of logic that goes through or does not go through. And the little story lays out the examples. So Lukashenko says, well, everyone's going to come and protest against my government. They'll be out in the streets tomorrow. There's virtually nothing I can do. But at night, he makes an announcement that I'm asking my police to do whatever we can do, and my advice is to the police is the following. Of the people who are protesting, arrest the 10 oldest people and jail them. That's my request to them. Of the protesters, protest the 10 oldest people. Suppose Belarus is a country with a slightly unusual information structure. In this country, everybody knows everybody's age. And in fact, I will make a game theoretic assumption. This is an extreme assumption, but makes my storytelling easier, that the age of the people of Belarus is common knowledge. So everyone knows everyone's age, and everyone knows that everyone knows everyone's age, and everyone knows that everyone knows that everyone knows everyone's age. That's the age is very, very widely known. Now, a fascinating thing happens the next morning. See, when of 10 million protesters, 10 people may be arrested, people don't mind going out. I'm going to go out, very small chance of my being arrested. It's an important enough cause, I will go out and protest. So that the eruption would have taken place. But the next morning after this announcement by Lukashenko, one interesting thing will happen. The 10 oldest people will not go out to protest because they know that if they go out to protest, even if there are 10 million people, given the policy of the government, it's a certainty that they will be arrested. If you're sure of being arrested, it's not worth going out and protesting. The cost to yourself is too big. So the 10 oldest people will not go out and protest. But there's another thing that happens. The second 10 oldest people in Belarus now faces a problem. They know, since everyone knows everyone's age, everyone has heard Lukashenko's announcement, everyone will know that the 10 oldest people are not going to come out to protest. Others may come out. Immediately it follows that the second 10 oldest people, for them it does not make sense to come out and protest because they know that the 10 oldest people will not be there. So if they are there, they will be arrested for sure. If you are sure you're being arrested, it's not worthwhile for you to do it. They will not be there. But by that logic, the third 10 oldest people will not go out to protest because they know that the 10 oldest people will not go out to protest, and they know that because of that, the second 10 oldest people will not go out to protest, and because of that, it's not worthwhile for them to go out to protest. So the third 10 oldest people will not go out to protest, and now you've got backward induction at work, like in a famous paradox in philosophy called the surprise test paradox. The protest is going to fizzle out. No one will go out because of the unwinding of the structure. In reality, of course, we don't have this kind of common knowledge. But this kind of common knowledge is an extreme assumption which leads to the unwinding totally. But you can have other kinds of knowledge structure which would cause you the same problem. Milder forms of common knowledge would cause unwinding. And that is what I feel is the crux of why do some revolutions fail and why do some revolutions succeed. Let me get into, I am taking a little longer than I was expecting. Let me get into the last topic with dictators, and then I might through Q&A also come back. One particular problem that has been fascinating me and troubling me is why very often, if you look through the world history, dictators and rulers get worse over time. They morph into more evil, more tyrannical, more brutal behavior. I actually have a bit of a personal story on this, which jolted me in a way that I did not think that in real life I would get a jolt of this kind. This is to do with Nicaragua, the rule of Daniel Ortega. Daniel Ortega, many of you will know, led one of the most important revolutions in Latin America against the vicious, absolutely vicious, tyrannical, exploitative regime of Somoza. And in fact, in I hope I'm getting the year right, 79, in 1979, if I'm getting it wrong, it'll be 1 or 2 years wrong. The revolution in Nicaragua is successful. He overthrows the regime of Somoza, comes into power. For some time he's in power, then he gets thrown out, he's again back in power. But to my generation, growing up first in India, in revolutionary days in Calcutta was very prominent, in Delhi, and when I was a student at the London School of Economics in the mid-1970s, the Sandinista revolution was taking place in Nicaragua, and all we were hearing is, we knew very little about Daniel Ortega, that he's fighting against the dreadful dictatorship of Somoza. And he overthrew the Somoza regime. 2013, September, I am in Managua for the second time. Actually, I had been to Managua once before, second time in Managua, this time properly as a World Bank chief economist of the World Bank. I'm in Managua, and it's a remarkable experience, I have to say. One day, I was there for 3 days. I go to a police center running a rehabilitation center for sex workers, mainly for women sex workers. There were some men as well. I went there, met these women, former sex workers. They were actually so comfortable and good talking to me, feeling comfortable in that setting, that I just felt that it's a remarkable administration. I asked, who is the head of the police? It turned out to be a woman for whom I later on met her, great respect, Aminta Granera, head of the police force. I was very impressed by what I was seeing. I then felt that I would like to see Nicaragua, I'd like to see Daniel Ortega, who had led the revolution. In my youth, I had watched the revolution from afar. There were some stories about Ortega not being quite what he is, but you know, with any leader, you would hear that. I wanted to meet him. I sent a message from the World Bank office to the president's office, president of Nicaragua, that I would like to meet with him. The World Bank office told me that, look, Daniel Ortega doesn't quite enjoy talking to World Bank people, so he probably won't agree. So I sent a message back to the president saying, look, I'm not coming here as a World Bank person. As a student in London, I had watched the Sandinista revolution. I would like to talk to him. The last day I was at a meeting with the World Bank and a message came that the president will see you. So I ran from the meeting. I excused myself. I said, look, I won't get this opportunity again. Had a very interesting meeting of Somoza, of the early days of the revolution, etc. But if you follow Nicaragua now, I feel ashamed that I was there with him because it's turned out to be an absolutely grisly regime. Brutalities of a kind that you would not imagine. He's arresting anyone who opposes him. Any media that opposes him is getting opposed, getting locked up. Political leaders who oppose him are getting locked up. Freedom of speech is gone from Nicaragua. It's become a dreadful regime. It's Daniel Ortega. Well, I did not know when I met him. I met him in good faith. And anyway, it was just a conversation, but it's a horror story. What happened? Why did this happen? I now believe that I have an explanation, which I'm trying to write down as a paper. I won't have time to go into any great detail. I'll give you just a glimpse of it. So another 4 or 5 minutes. And then if you have an interest, write to me. I'm working on this. If you have any comments, give this to me. So I thought I will take this great advantage of the Edmund Clark lecture to talk about something which is contemporary and at the same time is of interest to me. So it was pure luck for me when I got the invitation from Chris and others from your university to give this lecture. So here is my explanation of what might be happening. Not always to dictators, why they get worse. And the explanation is actually rooted in something very simple. Very often in life, some of the most dramatic things in life have some of the simplest of explanations. And while I was thinking about the morphing of Daniel Ortega, and we've seen morphing of other leaders as well through the world who start with one kind of idealism and end up absolutely a vicious leader. What happens? And my thought was, it is a little bit of a very trivial example, but the logic is there. George Akerlof, the economist, the Nobel laureate economist, had a beautiful paper in American Economic Review based on his experience in India. George Akerlof had, in the late 1970s, spent a year in India, and the paper is about procrastination. Why do we procrastinate? Why do we get addicted to things? A whole lot of behavior where we, in retrospect, we regret our behavior. Why do we get into that? Akerlof gave a beautiful paper with an explanation based on his own experience of procrastination. When he was living in India, his friend, Joe Stiglitz, the famous economist, was visiting India. Joe was there for a short period, so Stiglitz's visit came to an end. When he was leaving, he had a parcel of books that he did not have time to mail to himself and did not have space to carry. He gave it to George Akerlof, told George Akerlof, will you please mail it to me? George Akerlof and Joe Stiglitz are very close friends. George Akerlof said, for me to mail something of Joe Stiglitz is like mailing my own package to myself to my home. So he said, sure, he took the parcel. And his plan was that he would mail it the next day, next morning. He would not keep Joe waiting over there. Next morning, he got up. He felt that, the Indian postal system is a bit cumbersome. He'll have to go join a queue. He's not good at this kind of a thing. So he'll push it back by another day. Next morning, he got up. He thought that, oh gosh, I don't feel like spending that time in the post office. And one more day can't hurt Joe. So he pushed back the mailing of the parcel one more day, and then one more day. And I think he finally pushed it back by 7 months. He did not mail this parcel. He writes up a little paper about tiny human irrationality, not being able to foresee the full future and giving salience to the current situation can lead you to dreadful mistakes. And I feel there is a germ of that idea in why dictators morph into monstrous characters. And we have similar examples of the Akerlof type story, like how people inflict torture on others, like Stanley Milgrams, which gives, for a very, very important, troubling problem, a similar explanation. I'm going to give you one verbally just now. When a person becomes a leader, suppose you become a total leader, but you have some initial ambitions. You want to do good for the country. After your first term is coming to an end, and we have seen some of this play out in United States with Donald Trump trying to do anything to stay on in power. At the end of your term, first term, say it's a 4-year term, you've done your 4-year term and you're trying to take a decision whether you will do dreadful things, intrigue, political cheating to stay on another term. You do a calculation, cost-benefit analysis. Another term as the leader of the country is fun for you, and you still have some idealism. You will try to do a couple of good things. So you decide that it is worthwhile for me to indulge in some political intrigue, little bits of corruption in order to stay on in power for one more term. You stay for one more term and you stay on for one more term. Each time you're indulging in greater and greater political intrigue and evil to stay on. There's one thing which is happening into the future that you may not be calculating properly. And I feel typically behavioral economics would tell us we do not calculate properly, which is the similar logic to George Akerlof's procrastination. Look at it this way. Once you've indulged in some evil to stay on in power, you face one problem. Your exit cost of power becomes much worse. Once you exit from power, there will be questions about what you had done when you were in power. There may be a trial brought against you. There may be war criminals charges brought against you. So your exit option, which was in the beginning, when you first came to power, an innocent person with no track record of bad things, your exit option was, well, I'll just lose power, go back to my civilian life. But once you indulge in intrigue for one term, exit option gets worse. 2 terms, you've indulged in more intrigue to stay on in power, more political corruption, it gets worse. Ultimately, you have a screaming need to stay in power because your exit option has gotten so bad that you can't afford to go out. Kim Jong-un in North Korea today, no matter what his original intention, can't afford to get out of power today because his out of power, his future is dreadful. Putin's is very, very similar. This logic can be written up as a tiny model whereby you morph into a dreadful leader, and the collectivity of the society that I began from, you're going to create a huge, awful, bizarre collectivity of your society, but taking small periods of rational decision. Give me 1 minute, Chris. I know I've gone over my time. What do we do with this? First of all, I believe that even for the worst of realities, the big mistake is to look the other way. When the world is so troublesome, to look the other way and not look at reality does not work. Just being angry with what is happening is not good enough. I worked in India as an advisor. There is a lot of corruption in India. There was a lot of corruption then. There is a lot of corruption now. People would be angry, and I actually did work with an absolutely remarkable prime minister, fastidiously honest person, trying to do anything to control corruption. But controlling corruption is not easy. When it is wedded into a society, you have to design policies. If you do it badly, you will do so much harm to the economy that you will regret. Likewise, when you're trying to control a dreadful political leadership coming into power, just being angry plays very little role. In fact, in anger in general plays very little role. You have to put your mind to it, understand the infrastructure, the strategic interaction between the leadership, between the people, which is resulting in this. What I've given you is a couple of ingredients of understanding on collective bad behavior, on how society can morph into a worse and worse dictatorship. I believe the solution to this lies in creating future constitutions, not just for a single country, but for the world. A constitution created not just by being angry with the corruption and the dictatorship, but by bringing your mind with the finest examples from game theory, from the analysis, from political science we have, to create the structure of a constitution that can create a better world. You know, when you think of a constitution for the world, it seems hopeless. You can have a UN charter, which will have very little bite. How can you do anything? But, you know, when you were creating a constitution for United States, for a huge country, it must have looked equally hopeless. When India was thinking of a constitution, a huge country coming into independence, and India created an idealistic constitution, it had appeared hopeless, but we did it. The time is here for us to look at the world, stare at the world with all its faults, and think of an agreement among us across the peoples of the world. It won't be easy. It may not even happen, but I feel we have to bring our best minds to that and take this on. If we can go over the current challenge, it'll be like going over the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution, after we brought in novel regulations, new kinds of laws, and actually that's a period that's of great interest to me. It's phenomenal what we human beings achieved. We are at that kind of a juncture again. It's a very, very troubled world we live in. But if we can bring in our best, we can do wonders for the world. And it is a time to bring in the determination, the grit, and along with that, the analysis and the intellect to try to solve the problem. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity.
So that was incredibly interesting. There were a couple games there, one in particular, and I'm not going to tell you which one because I'm going to steal it for my exam, but that I actually think is a perfect example for some of my students to think through in one of the problems that, well, they'll probably get now. We'll see how many of them are actually paying attention. We have the Q&A is open, so please add your questions to the Q&A, or I'm not sure whether we can actually do the raising hands and I can unmute you to ask the question, but we can try that if you prefer to ask your question.
Once I'll be very happy to take.
And I have some in chat, but just a quick question on that last game with the lack of exit strategy. That is or let's call it exit opportunity that may allow somebody to leave power without facing war crimes or some other cost or maintain their wealth and so on. Do you said that you think that they might be underestimating this procrastination event going into the future, but I wonder if you really need them to be not perfectly foresightful in this environment, because as long as the early on cost or the early on benefits of holding on to power, for example, by revolutionizing the system. For example, if you think of people that go in and just turn everything and usher in a new system of government, maybe they see that benefit as worth it, even though after they do that and the costs that they put into place to do that might prevent them from ever being able to leave power, because they'll face the consequences for those earlier actions. So it wasn't clear that you actually need them to be irrational or not foresightful. I wonder what you think of that.
Chris, see, there are two things to it. One is, if you really end up in a completely grotesque regime, there are two possibilities. One is that you never thought that this is so grotesque, and you are now sitting there. Putin may not think that it's a grotesque regime that he has created. Lukashenko may not. It's possible. But I feel there are two explanations, both with different kinds of behavioral explanations. One is the one I gave, but I'm glad you asked, because it's now pushing me into another one. It's also possible that there will never be an admitted irrationality, because we have to live with ourselves. So once we create a grotesque system, we begin to justify to ourselves that we have no choice. Russia has no choice. The way the West is putting a stranglehold around Russia. So I do believe that, is Putin so clear-headed that he goes to sleep saying that I should not have got into this mess? I don't think so. So probably what you're saying is right, that he says that, well, I've done everything rational and now I have to continue with rationality. But I do believe that human beings have a tendency to justify what you've got yourself into. So you don't even want to say that it was an irrational decision. You want to look at the world differently and say it is justified. And given that you asked this, I'm not trying to remember in those olden days if I used to give this example. Stanley Milgram's very famous example is actually a bit similar to what you're saying. Stanley Milgram did this lab experiments on asking people to inflict torture on others. And these experiments showed, if on the first day you tell them to give huge electric shocks to others, people will say, no, I had told you I'll participate in your experiment, but this is against my principles. But if you first day make them give small shocks and give them a reward of $10 for giving little shocks, next day raise the shocks, electric shocks more, then even more, then even more. Then the same level of electric shock, which on the first day they would have said, it's against my principle, I'll never do that to another human being, they can reach that. So rationality itself can begin to morph, so it may not be irrational. Thank you. I mean, it just draws my attention to other complex possibilities, and this is work in progress. Thank you.
And do you think there's any way to commit to not throwing the book at them if they leave power? I mean, if we were to say, okay, we actually have an island for you.
So that is the other problem, that if you do that, tell Kim Jong-un, I've thought often that Kim Jong-un knows what's in Kim Jong-un's head. He may feel that if I try to step out of this, I will be killed immediately by my generals. So one way out of Kim Jong-un is if the United States says that give up power, we'll pull you out and put you on an island, which will be all for yours. That may do it if you can give him a very quick exit. I'm assuming that he is itching to get out. The only problem with that, Chris, is you create other people becoming dictators, not because they want to be dictators, but because they want that island on the sea, which United States will give them at the end of that. So you may create new incentives. So the challenge is, again, I'm pointing to the sort of scenario that leads to these morphed, dreadful regimes. The solution that you just now talked about, giving them an exit option, I have thought about that a lot. And in the paper, I will discuss that a little bit, with the risk that that will create incentives for others to do that in order to get. So you'll again have to think through more.
Okay, we have a question from Boyd Holmes. How do you respond to the phenomenon of Napoleon III, often called the first modern dictator? He was fairly oppressive as ruler in the 1840s, then relaxed many of his earlier oppressive restrictions throughout the 1850s. In other words, his rule became less oppressive over time, not more.
So it is possible. In fact, I feel it is a kind of moral strength that one needs in a leader who has a huge amount of power, to say that once I've got that power, I've done it with only one ambition, to create a better society. So it is possible to do that. However, you have to keep in mind that there's one genuine problem, and one is, of course, you get used to the joys of power and pageantry, whereby you don't even care for that, and which is what happens to most people. The other is staying on in power becomes so precarious and difficult that you have to indulge in intrigue to stay on in power. I also think of someone like Deng Xiaoping in China. When he comes into power, he could have actually thought of his own power, like Mao Zedong, consolidate and make it a dreadful power in his own hand. He didn't do that. I mean, he had some limits to what he was willing to do, despite having a huge amount of power. So I think we have seen examples, and I like to believe that there are people with moral commitments who come to power, get a huge amount of power, but they don't forget their original ambition, but that you're relying on the luck of morality, the luck of the pick of morality.
Very interesting. So I have another question here, and it says, where do you think India is heading under Modi's regime? And yeah, I guess does this fit into any of the comments that you're saying?
You know, in India, it is true that the huge space, India was absolutely remarkable. I can tell you from my time in the government of India that the freedom of press was remarkable. In my published diary, I've said that every time I would come out of an important meeting with the ministers and all, journalists would throng. It would be aggressive questions being asked about what's done. So I took a great pride. I used to meet at G20 meetings. I used to head, actually Canada and me, Paul Rochon of Canada used to head one G20 initiative, and I used to head India. We were together heading this map process of G20. And there, very often, I would tell people about the space India had, the democratic space. And people would point out that outside of the advanced economies, very few countries had that, and it's a remarkable quality in India. That is getting eroded. So there is concern about it. I just like to feel, again, that there are people who are aware that you can't do this damage to India, because this was a matter of great pride for India. It does not make ruling easy. I remember during the inflation, I was there in India during the high inflation. If the data on the inflation could be repressed, it would have made my life much easier as the chief economic advisor to India. But fortunately, that was never done. Every week, there would be drilling we would get. That makes for a better society. And I hope that though we have seen negative events, that will not take over. We will have the sense to prevail that this is an Indian heritage, which is absolutely remarkable. Got a lot of global appreciation, really that India for a developing country. And in the long run, I feel it helps the economy. It's harder, but it helps the economy. Economy grows faster if you have this space. So fingers crossed.
And where do you put, where should we think about, how should we think about Lee Kuan Yew of Singapore, benevolent dictator?
Very difficult, these questions. You know, Lee Kuan Yew, again, in the early days, I have to say also the trajectory of history is such that very often, even a dictator is not all powerful. A country takes a turn for the better, despite an authoritarianship of a kind that should not be there. And if you look at the early Asian economies, when Lee Kuan Yew first came to power, I have to say I had distaste for the total authoritarian control. People for the smallest slips being put behind bars, that was dreadful. And I feel we should be critical of that kind of history. But Singapore does stand as an example that has morphed from that kind of a control into an increasingly open society. But I want to remind people who give Singapore as an example. Most examples in the world are, once you get authoritarian leadership getting total control, it slips very, very easily into, first of all, crony capitalism, because the big businesses realize that you have to just capture 2-3 political powers at the top and you've captured the country. So once that happens, usually these rules go the way we have seen. I was giving examples from Latin America, from Somoza's Nicaragua, to what we are today seeing happening in Nicaragua. It becomes cronyism with total capture. Singapore, I do have to say, despite an authoritarian start of a kind for which I have no approval, it has morphed into an increasingly better and open society, and we will just hope that that trajectory continues. But no country should make the mistake of going that route, because 99 out of 100 countries, you mess up the economy, you mess up total control for many, many years.
And Boyd, who asked one of the first questions, followed up with a comment that he'd be interested in how you respond to 2 specific books on the topic, or if you have thoughts on them, if you've read them. The Origins of I can't even say the word, but you know what book I'm talking about.
Hannah Arendt.
The classic
Hannah
one.
Arendt, I suppose.
Yep. Yeah. And Crowds in Power by Elias Canetti. Yeah,
I don't know the Elias Canetti book, but Hannah Arendt is absolutely majestic. And so these early works for me are very, very important because it's very powerful thought. You will also get some of this kind of thinking in Nietzsche. Nietzsche writes very beautifully that in individuals, insanity is occasional and rare. But in groups of people, very often insanity is the norm, which is almost in poetic language, talking about Greta's theorem that I'm talking about. So these early writings for me are very, very inspiring. But, and there is a but, to be able to craft and design policy, you need to blend that with the greater insights you've got from modern day game theory. And I'll give you one example. I'm glad you asked this question. I want to give you one example, which for me is very important. Political power of the kind that Václav Havel is talking about, you will get some of the deepest insights into that, where the tyrant's power, Havel is making the simple point that the tyrant's power is not because of the tyrant's strong muscles, or the number of weapons that the tyrant has in the tyrant's home. Beyond the point, there is only that much that an individual can do. The tyrant's power is because of ordinary people's beliefs. We prop up one another's beliefs, and create these huge edifices of power. So the power of the tyrant resides in the beliefs of ordinary individuals. That is what Havel says. There is a precursor to that. 1750s, David Hume. If you read David Hume on the power of the leader, it's absolutely majestic. Hume is hitting the nail on the head, very similar point to what Havel is making. But if you want to analyze that, create policies, create safeguards, you need to give it a bit more structure. For that, we needed a game theorist. And by game theory, I'm not talking of algebra and models. Thomas Schelling's idea of the focal point suddenly gives shape to those early ideas. So I do believe those early ideas are inspiring. The early writings, Hannah Arendt to me is very, very special. Those are inspiring, but you do need modern theorizing. And fortunately, we are now beginning to see a blending of game theory can go one route, which is just mathematical results, important in a way, but you want to distill and bring things out. There is a certain amount of philosophical writing taking place, analytical philosophical writing. There is a book by Peter van der Schraaf, which has come out, which is taking little bits of game theoretic logic and blending with these contemporary problems. That's the way to go.
And David Kister points out that an example of protest that were suggested that caused regime change was the Arab Spring. And what we saw is that the protests worked, but actually also created opportunities for others to take over. And you could think about the revolution in Iran in a similar way. And I think you mentioned this a little bit during the talk, but yeah, I wonder if you want to comment on that.
Extremely important matter that very often when a revolt starts with a genuine good ambition, then somewhere along the way, it gets distorted. And even if you think of USSR, the Russian Revolution, 1917, there's a lot of early idealism, which is genuine idealism, which is no one is trying to take capture. But USSR ends up creating one of the worst. I describe it as a crony capitalist society. So it's communism, which in the end morphs into a crony capitalist society. So always there is that risk that after you overthrow a totalitarian leader, Arab Spring is full of that example, then again, what comes out of it is another kind of a bizarre, awful system. So those risks are always there. My hope, once again, is that we have to take this idea of a prior human constitution, a collectivity of human beings, which we've earlier done for the population of United States, we've earlier done for the population of India, which was a huge challenge, where you come and lay some ground rules for the future. Again, it's not a complete guarantee that won't be violated, but when India did it, United States was already with the European influence, it was not such a big surprise. When India did it, it was quite staggering that you're creating a modern constitution in a country which is just coming out of the early years of colonialism. I feel for the world, it is a time where you have to create ground rules for the world, because we live in such a globalized world that just a set of rules for Canada, just a set of rules for India, just a set of rules for another country is not good enough. There's just too much going on. There is also today, we are beginning to feel with the COVID and pandemic crisis, the supply chain problems. Today, one country can hold another country to ransom by doing nothing else, but just by saying, I'll cut off the supply chain. Let me see you run your economy. Occasionally, that can be put to good use, like if you try to strangle the Russian economy right now. But we do need rules, because this is going to be misused massively in the future. The hope, again, is we will do it. But I have to say, I'm not a complete optimist. I'm not a complete pessimist. It's a troubled world we live in, just that human beings have the mental capacity, unlike the dinosaur, which when it faced the existential challenge, the dinosaur didn't have the capacity to sit back and think, let's restructure the way we live. Whereas we human beings have one difference from the dinosaur. As we face these challenges, we can pause and say, look, we have one difference from the dinosaur. We can change our own rules of the game. And that's what we have to do collectively. So it is an opportunity for the world, but there are risks which we cannot deny.
We have three final questions, and I think that they're all very interesting ones, and so worth making our way through them. But One of them, which is related to just some of the coverage that we've heard about Russia, is, do you think dictators being insulated from problems and normal civilian life, or maybe we can expand on that and saying like just feedback, honest feedback in general? How much do you think this contributes to them getting morally worse over time?
Yeah, there are two things to it: morally worse and just wrong decisions. Even if that does not morally or bad enough, but it leads to wrong decisions. Actually, you know, the big Chris, one of the I don't know who asked the question. One of the most stark examples of this is the Great Famine in China, which happened during Mao Zedong's time. You will remember, those familiar with this, is in 1958, Mao Zedong announces the Great Leap Forward, whereby he would collectivize farms, take away individual incentives of farmers. It is an idealistic society that Mao Zedong is trying to create in one leap, the Great Leap Forward. He would be producing steel in backyards of farms. So it's a huge idealistic move. It starts in 1958, 1959. By 1960, agricultural production is dropping off. Incentives have been killed. The market survives on an intricate structure of incentives. The invisible hand is never as perfect as we make it out to be, but never as non-existent as some people believe it is. It plays a very, very important role. Mao Zedong had crushed the invisible hand. But what we know now is, and you don't know whether to pardon Mao Zedong or not, he did not know the extent of damage that was happening in China. No one had the courage to go up to Mao Zedong and say that, Mr. President, the policy that you started has backfired totally. So he was being given a picture, which was actually such a picture of a different dressing, that the total number of deaths that had taken place in the Great Famine of China, which is the greatest recorded famine in world history. Now we know, scholars, my PhD advisor Amartya Sen did some of the most important work over there. 30 million people dead, and there are now Chinese scholars which are saying it could be 40 million people dead. Information had been cut out. So I've been reading also, the Americans are saying that Putin is probably not getting information about what's happening. So I don't think it's contributing to his immorality. That's already there, but it is contributing to his making worse decisions. And it's a tiny little bit game being played out. His advisors, it's not in anyone's individual interest to get up and say that, Mr. President, it's not working the right way. And then it's backfiring collectively.
Great. And then a question just about nuclear threats and how this potentially changes how this needs to be considered in these types of models.
Yeah, again, fascinating question. This is the big thing that looms over our head, which did not do several decades ago when the nuclear threat was not there. In this case, you're playing out both sides, playing out saying that you can't take one more, the step which takes you all the way to a nuclear war, you can't afford to take. Additional trouble is you don't know what's going on in the mind of Putin. Does he want to avoid, or does he not care that the world goes off? So you're playing under great uncertainty. Over here, all I can tell you is that one historical example of having a similar situation with a nuclear threat looming over our head, where actually United States played the game very, very well, is 1962 October, the Cuban Missile Crisis. After the United States found out that the Russians had placed missiles in Cuba, which could hit American cities in 8 minutes or 9 minutes, the cities would be hit. The US for 5 days deliberated about what is the right strategy vis-a-vis Russia. 5 days, the first 5 days, it's 13 days of tension. First 5 days, no one knew apart from President Kennedy and his advisors, that the US was strategizing against Russia. But now in retrospect, since all this was recorded, we have the full recording of the conversation that was taking place in the Oval Room of President Kennedy. And it is game theory at its height. The strategy is being played, and game theory with a dose of morality. Occasionally, a general would say, why don't we, without telling the Russians, suddenly flatten out Cuba? The missiles will be gone and everything will be gone. Kennedy holds back. saying that, no, we also have to have some commitment to other human beings. I believe that the leader of a big nation like United States has to have a huge commitment to other nations as well, the people of other nations. But it was game theory at its best, and one has to give a tribute to Khrushchev on the Russian side. Khrushchev did cut a deal, we know in retrospect, about the United States backing out of Turkey, which was kept secret to give Kennedy that space that Kennedy had got the upper hand. Khrushchev agreed to it. So both sides played the game theoretically perfectly. And Thomas Schelling, it should be pointed out, a few years before the Cuban Missile, not a few years, few months before the Cuban Missile Crisis, President Kennedy had asked Thomas Schelling to write a paper on the use of game theory in strategy. So it was actually theory being put to its best use.
Do you recommend the movie Dr. Strangelove for the
I do recommend for great fun, but I also recommend the actual recordings of it's by May and one more author, the edited book, which is the tapes, the 13 days of the secret recording, which couldn't be published for 35 years, but now it's available. The Kennedy tapes, where you actually hear the whole thing out, and Strangelove as well.
And then the final question that we've had submitted is specifically asked about China, but I wonder if the lessons apply more broadly. But what do you think about the future of all of this, the future of China, considering the lockdown policies, potentially extreme lockdown policies inside the countries, or the need to maybe step up control and information and so on?
So China, it's a very tricky problem. It could go the Singapore route, but I feel it has a bigger risk that as the control is getting more and more centralized at the top, it could mess up the country. Because again, you'll begin to get problems like information not going up to the top. So right at the top, policies will be made without the real decisions being going up. So I feel for China, this is a very, very dangerous point. If this control remains total, it's probably going to, in the long run, wreck the Chinese economy the way this has happened with most leaders. There is a small chance that it will go the way, the example was given from the Napoleonic period, the example was given, I mentioned Singapore, where you will be able to morph out of this in a better direction, but it's a very risky situation, and I hope the Chinese leaders are aware of that.
Excellent. So Warren, do you want to take back over and lead the thanks and applause?
Well, I think Professor Basu, we would be having quite a strong round of applause from all of the people who have participated in this seminar. It was fascinating. I really enjoyed your thoughts and the discussion that followed. And I think you get a sense from the questions and the breadth of the questions that, you've really got people online thinking about these topics. I do want to express our thanks to you for taking part in this lecture series. It's an important lecture series to the school and to the Department of Economics. This is something that we look forward to every year or every other year. And we're just thrilled that you were able to take part. So on behalf of Queens and on behalf of our units, thank you so much for this contribution. Thank you, Professor Cotton, for moderating the session. And thank you to everyone online for your participation and your interest in the topic. It's certainly highly relevant to today's situation, and I think we've all learned a lot. So thanks so much.
Thank you.
And with that, I'm going to draw a close to this session. Again, reminders that we do have another session tomorrow, which will go in a little bit of a different direction, but which will be equally interesting. We have a very important session with our Governor General coming up next week. Do mark your calendars. Look forward to seeing others online, and have a great evening. Good night, everybody.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.